Today's lesson is a 7th grade lesson 1.4. The objectives: students will use the idea that when solving a multiplication problem that involves integers, they will multiply between the numbers as usual and then count the signs to determine if the answer is positive or negative. The standards that will be covered in this lesson are 7NS2, A, B, and C, 7NS3, and 7EE3. The book page numbers out of the Big Idea Red Book are pages 24 through 27 out of the hardcover book and page 18 out of the practice journal. To begin within this lesson, I kind of want to give you a visual of what we are working with when we are multiplying numbers. Here you can see I have 2 times 3. So I went ahead and set it up as 2 3 times, where we ended up taking 2 plus 2 plus 2, where we were moving on the number line 2 spaces, and we did that 3 times. Okay, and when we were finished, we ended at 6. Okay, that's working with whole numbers. Today you guys are going to be working with integers, which include those negative numbers. So here's an example of something that we might work with today. We may work with something like, instead of 2 times 3, maybe we're going to do negative 2 times 3. So if we were going to represent negative 2 times 3 on our number line, well, we're still going to start at 0, for those of you that need that visual. And we're going to drop backwards 2 places 3 times. So there would be 2 places. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3, and we end up at negative 6. This is just a visual representation of something that we'll be working with. Now, it's not really ideal for you to use a number line, considering we're going to be working with numbers that are much bigger than 2 times 3. So the rule that I'm going to go ahead and present to you would be something like this. When we multiply integers, we're going to count the negative signs. If there is an even number of negative signs, the answer is positive. If there's an odd number of negative signs, the answer will be negative. What I tend to do, just to help you remember, is if you were to look at 2 negative signs, you could take one of those negative signs and flip it, and you would end up with a plus sign if you were to put those 2 together. So that's kind of how I remember, is if there's an even number, you could create positive signs. If there was an odd number, you would have one left over a negative sign that would create everything to be a negative answer. So, looking at the samples that we have here, back in lesson, I think it was 2 or 3, I'm not quite sure, we worked with where we would have 2 negative signs right next to each other. So I've kind of already introduced this to you. Anytime we had 2 negative signs, we could take those 2, it's an even number, and we could turn one of them to make a positive 12. Okay. Here, sometimes we may end up with more than 2 negative signs. So like here, those 2 would make a plus sign, but then this last one right here would end up making our answer a negative 12. And notice, here was an even number of negatives, and in this situation, we had an odd number. So we can use that even odd rule to help us decide whether our answer is going to be positive or negative. So let's practice a few of these. Okay, so we're going to start out really basic, where we're just going to count our negative signs. So if we go through and we count our negative signs, 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 4 negative signs. So 4 is an even number. These 2 would make a plus sign. These 2 would make a plus sign. We end up with a positive 6. Okay, so the answer would be positive 6 there, simplified. So we're going to count our negatives, and then if it's an even number when we counted, it's a positive answer, and if it's an odd number, it's a negative answer. Here we have 1, 2 negative signs. So is that even or odd? That would be even, which would make our answer a positive 8. Okay, here's another situation. Sometimes, just depending on what you're working with, they will throw a plus sign in there. Don't let that confuse you. When you are working with this, you are only counting the negatives. So here we're going to only count the negatives. 1, 2, 3. So 3 is an odd number, which tells me that it's going to be a negative answer. So here we end up with negative 13. And make sure, just a note for you, these are all kind of multiplying by each other, multiplying. So the opposite of negative 13, and the opposite of the positive of the opposite of negative 13, really confusing. It's just easier to go through and count your negative signs. So this rule applies when you multiply or you divide integers. Why don't you try this one on your own? The answer you should have gotten was positive 14 because there are 2 negative signs. Remember, we're not going to count these. So you should have ended up with positive 14. All right, so let's go ahead and put this together with some multiplication. When we multiply integers, first thing, we're going to go ahead and multiply the digits as normal. So don't think of this as a whole new process. We're taking 2 things that we previously learned and put them together. So we're going to multiply the numbers as normal. Then we're going to count our negative signs. If there's an even number of negative signs, it's a positive answer. And if there's an odd number, it's a negative answer. So here, I'm going to go ahead and think 7 times 10, which would give me 70. To finish out my answer, I'm going to go through and count how many negative signs are present. Since we're multiplying, that's why we get to count. There's only 1 negative sign present, which would make our answer a negative 70. So negative 7 times 10 equals negative 70. Let's try one more together. Okay, here I use the same digits, so the multiplication part is going to be easy. So remember, we're going to multiply the digits by themselves first. 7 times 10 is 70, so I got the same digit as the last one. Now I'm going to count my negative signs. There's 1, 2. That's an even number of negatives. And since we're multiplying, that's why we get to count the negatives. So even means it's a positive 70. So here, negative 7 times negative 10 is positive 70. Okay, why don't you go ahead and try these 2? If you need to, you can pause your video. I'll give you a couple seconds to go through and answer these. You should have gotten negative 63 for the first one and positive 63 for the second one. Okay, sometimes you have problems where you have more than 2 factors. So here you still follow the same rules. And since we are multiplying, we're going to go ahead and work left to right. The key thing to remember is some people maybe can multiply certain numbers a little bit easier in their head. Since it is all multiplying, it really doesn't matter what order we multiply them in. So if we wanted to work left to right, we could. But in multiplying, 1 times 2 times 3 is going to give me 6, just as the same as if I had done the 2 times 3 times 1, I would still get 6. So in multiplication, I can go ahead and change the order as long as it's all multiplying. Okay, so if I go through and I work through this, I can either work left to right or I can chunk, and I'll kind of prove to you that on this one. So the first thing I always do is I like to count my negative signs, because that's probably the easiest process to me. So if I go through, I've got 2, I know my answer is going to be a positive answer, so I'm just going to put a plus sign so I don't forget that I've already done that step. Now, if I go through and I do this, 7 times 9 is 63, times 10, I'm just going to add a 0 to the end. So we would get 630. Okay, I would have gotten the same answer had I gone through and multiplied maybe these 2 together first. There I would get 90, and then if I did 90 times 7, well, 7 times 9 is 63, add the 0. I would still end up at the positive 630. So just remember, as long as it's all multiplying, you can rearrange the order if it's easier for you to do in your head. Okay, so let's try another one. Okay, I happen to use the same digits here, so we know we're going to end up with that same digit. The only thing that's going to change is possibly the symbols on our answer. So when I count that, I have 1, 2, 3 negative signs. My answer is going to be negative. And then thinking back to the previous one, we got 630 because it was still 7, 9, and 10 as our digits. So we ended up with negative 630. don't you go ahead and try these two? Go ahead and pause the video to give yourself a little bit of time to go ahead and finish this. Here, you should have ended up on the first one with a positive, because we had two negatives, 140. And on the second one, you should have ended up with, let's see, how many negative signs? There's two, so we should have ended up with a positive 105. Okay, key thing is just understanding and training your brain to just count the negatives when you're doing multiplication. Okay, so what happens when we get integers that have exponents? So we're going to kind of review what happens when it's a positive integer. Well, here, if we had 4 squared, we could rewrite that as 4 times itself twice, right? Which would give us 16. Okay, so 4 squared would give us 16. What do you think would happen if they change that positive 4 to a negative 4? Okay, and notice that we put it in parentheses, meaning that negative is going to stick with the 4. Well, if I were to write it out like I did in this first example, it would look like this: negative 4 times negative 4, because we needed 2 of those, right? Now we're back to what we did previously. So we can go ahead and we can count our negative signs. 1, 2, so there's 2 negative signs, which would make a positive answer of 4 times 4 is 16. Take note, our exponent told us how many negative signs were going to be there, because that negative was included with that 4. Okay, because it was included, we can kind of use that exponent to help us count. Are we going to have an even number or an odd number? Well, 2 is an even number. That told us we had 2 negative signs. Okay, so if you need to visually write it out like this, then go ahead and do so. Some of you will be able to use that shortcut of just thinking, okay, 2 is an even number, so there's an even number or there's 2 negative signs. So let's try a few of these. Oops. How about this one? Negative 3 in parentheses to the third. So if you have to, you can think of it like this. Negative 3 times itself 3 times. Okay, so now if I count my negatives, there's 1, 2, 3. So 3 negatives tells me it's going to be a negative answer. And now I just think 3 times 3 times 3, which is 27. Okay, some of you will be able to go through and work off of like this, 3 to the third power is 27, and then use that little exponent to say, well, 3 is an odd number, it's going to be a negative answer. You have to decide what works for you. Some of you may need this step, and some of you will be able to go ahead and just do this part and use your exponent. Okay, so let's try another one. I'll actually just pull all 3 of these out. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and look at the first one of negative 2 to the 4th power. Those of you that need to see it would look like this. We have the negative 2 times itself 4 times. Now if we count our negatives, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. That's an even number, so it's a positive answer. And I'm going to put that down just so that you know that I did go through and check that. And then if we multiply 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, 8 times 2 would give us 16. We end up with positive 16. Okay, this second one looks a little bit different. Okay, so when we go ahead and look at that opposite of the negative 4 squared, we're not going to work with this until we finish out the problem, because when we work with this, this exponent is only applying to whatever is inside of our parentheses. So it does not apply to that negative. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and solve this part first. So if I were to think of negative 4 squared, well, my exponent tells me there's 2 negatives. So it's a positive answer originally. So 4 squared would give me 16. Now, because that parenthesis is on the outside, or sorry, that negative is on the outside, I now apply that. So my final answer would be negative 16. Really what this is saying is, what's the opposite of negative 4 squared? Well, negative 4 squared we said is 16, and the opposite would be negative 16. Okay, so let's go ahead and have you try this one. So you're going to simplify this first, and then bring down your negative onto your answer. You may have to simplify after that even. So if we look at our exponent, 3 is going to tell me that there's 3 negatives, because it's negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3. So 3 negatives tells me it's a negative answer. And then 3 times 3 is 9 times 3 is 27. Remember last week when we worked with this, what's our new answer going to be? Positive 27. Okay, and you can't simplify this first because that exponent on the outside is only applying to what's inside the parentheses. So you can't take that shortcut first. You have to solve any exponent before putting those two negatives together. That's why we didn't put them together until this step right here. Okay. Okay. So sometimes they're not going to have that negative inside of a parenthesis. So what happens here when I have negative 5 squared, but the parenthesis is not included? Well, it looks like this actually. You've got a negative, and then you have 5 times 5. So if that parenthesis is not around it, you're just going to apply that negative sign to your answer and now think, what is 5 squared, or 5 times 5? It's 25. Okay, so we're going to practice some of these where that negative's not included in the parenthesis. And these are difficult, but just remember that parenthesis is like it's grouping it together. It's associating those together. Okay, so here I'm thinking it's the opposite of 2 to the third power. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and bring my negative down because it wasn't included. And then I'm going to solve this. So 2 to the third power, 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8. So I end up with negative 8. Okay, let's try another one. And if you need to use your calculator for that 7 to the third power, that's okay. I'm not checking to see if you know all of those off the top of your head. You can use that. For those of you that maybe don't have an exponent button, some of your calculators will have buttons on them that look like this. So you would punch on your calculator like 7, and then this button here, and then 3. And then that's going to tell you what your answer is. Some of you, instead of having this button that looks like this, might have something that does maybe X to Y, or it could also be a Y to an X. Okay, either of those, and you would use the same process. You would punch in the 7 first, then one of these buttons, then the 3, and then equals. Okay, if you have a simpler calculator, you know, how would you write this out on paper if you had to write it out longhand? You would write it out like this, 7 times 7 times 7. Well, then that's exactly what you're going to punch in on your calculator, is 7 times 7 times 7. Okay, so if I go through and I solve this, my negative's going to come down in front. So 7 times 7 times 7 is going to give me 343. So it's a negative 343. Okay, here I'm not counting or using that exponent to decide is it positive or negative, because the negative was not in a parenthesis. It wasn't included with the 7. It's just sitting out in the front. So I want you to go ahead and try this one on your own. You should have gotten negative 16. Okay, so what happens when they give us expressions with exponents? So really this is what they're doing. The two previous slides were having us work as little chunks, and now they're going to put those together. So sometimes we're going to have where that parenthesis is around the number with the exponent, and sometimes it's not going to be. So just remember, when it's grouped together, that's when we get to use this process of counting how many negatives would be in there. So this is telling me there's 3 negatives. So 3 negatives in this group would be a negative answer, and then 3 to the third power would be 27. Okay, then I'm gonna go ahead and put my multiplication sign, and now I'm gonna solve this, because remember it says parentheses. Well, these parentheses really aren't grouping things together, they're just using it to include the negative sign. Then it's exponents, so we're solving our exponents, then we get to multiply. So now my 2 is telling me there's 2 negatives in this group, if I were to write it out longhand. So it's going to be a positive answer, and then 2 squared would be 4. Now I'm going to go ahead and multiply these together. So there's 1 negative in my setup there, just 1 right here. So my answer is going to be a negative answer. And then 27 times 4 gives me 108. So we end up getting a negative 108 for that one. Okay, so let's try another one. Okay, so once again, everything's in parentheses. So we're going to go ahead and simplify this. Because that's in a parenthesis, we get to use that rule of, hey, there's 2 negatives. So that's going to make it a positive. And then 7 times 7 is 49. Times, here there's 3 negatives, so that gives me a negative answer. So I'm going to put, just because this is the second one, I'm going to put it in a parenthesis. So I know I'm going to get a negative answer. And then 2 to the 3rd power would give me 8. Okay, final step is to go ahead and multiply these together. So when I look at my original factors, hey, it kind of looks like a smiley face. When I look at my original factors, I have 1 negative, so my answer is going to end up being a negative answer. And then 49 times 8 gives me 392. Okay, so showing your work would be showing me your simplifications here. If you're wishing to go ahead and do that 49 times 8 on your calculator, that's okay. I'm hoping you can do it longhand, but right now I'm not checking your longhand multiplication. I want to see, can you work with those integers? Okay, so why don't you go ahead and try these 2? You can go ahead and pause your video and work your way through them, and then when you start it back up, you can recheck your answers. So you should have ended up with 16 for the first one, positive. And then for the second one, you should have ended up also with a positive, but it would have been 27. All right, the last process out of this lesson is working with evaluations. And the key thing to remember is with evaluations, you have to include, if there's ever negatives, you have to write those down. Now today we're going to be working with multiplication. So we're going to start by putting numbers in parentheses. I think it makes it easier to look at. So here we've got n was worth 5. So I have 5. I'm going to put in parentheses my p and then put my little squared on the outside. So p was worth negative 8 and then squared. Now I follow orders of operation. So do I have parentheses? Yes, I do, but really it's just identifying an integer. Excuses exponents. So now I'm going to go ahead and simplify my exponents. So we're working orders of operation also. So here it's grouped together. So even number of negatives would be a positive answer. 8 times 8 is 64. So now I have 64 and I have 5 still sitting out here. Now if you want to use your calculator to finish this out, I'm okay with that. I'm not checking, can you do 64 times 5? I'm checking, are you able to substitute in? Can you work with those negatives and follow orders of operation? So 64 times 5 is going to give me 320. You should have ended up with a positive 320 because both of these were positive numbers. Okay, so let's try another one. Key thing is here is that you're substituting in correctly. Okay, so 2 times m plus p squared. So make sure that when you're doing this, put your replacement of m in a parenthesis, and here's why. Because if I write this out like this, 2, and then I write m as negative 2, that looks like 2 minus 2, when really it is 2 times negative 2. Okay, so it's probably very good practice to put everything in your parentheses. Plus p is worth negative 8, and then squared. Okay, so now we're going to simplify. Please is parentheses. Our parentheses here are just identifying integers. Excuse is exponents, so we're going to go ahead and simplify this part. Okay, so even number, it's going to be positive. 8 squared is 64. And I'm just writing everything down. Please is done, excuse is done. My dear is multiply, divide. Here's multiplying. So 2 times negative 2. 2 times 2 is 4. There's one negative, so it's negative 4. And then it's still plus 64. So now we're jumping back to lesson 2 of adding integers. So here I have different symbols. Find the difference. So I'm going to subtract. So the subtraction would be 60. Apply the larger sign. 64 was larger, so you should have ended up with positive 60 here. Okay, go ahead, pause your video, and run through both of these really quickly. Okay, so here's the work. So negative 2 squared times p was negative 8 plus m was negative 2 times n is 5. Okay. So you should have gotten negative 42. And then on this one, you should have gotten 80. Okay, just keep practicing at these, plug away, check yourself if you're not getting your answers correctly.